The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Kensington Palace as Camilla Parker stepped through the grand entrance with her usual confident stride. She'd been working as a senior aide to the royal household for nearly 8 years, a position that had brought her both prestige and access to the inner workings of one of the world's most famous families. Her role involved managing logistics for royal events, coordinating with staff, and ensuring that every detail of the Queen's daily schedule ran smoothly. That Tuesday morning seemed like any other. Camilla wore her signature navy blazer and carried a leather portfolio under her arm. She exchanged pleasantries with the guards at the entrance, signed in at the security desk, and made her way toward the administrative wing where her office was located. The palace was already buzzing with activity as staff members prepared for an upcoming state dinner scheduled for the following week. Around mid-morning, Camilla received a message requesting her presence in the Queen's private study. This was not unusual, as Her Majesty often consulted with senior staff members about various arrangements. Camilla gathered her notes and headed toward the royal apartments, her heels clicking softly against the stone corridors lined with centuries-old portraits and priceless artwork. When she arrived at the study, she found the atmosphere unusually tense. The Queen's private secretary stood by the window with a grave expression, while 2 members of the royal guard stood near the doorway in full ceremonial uniform. The Queen herself sat behind an ornate desk, her face unreadable, but her posture rigid with concern. The private secretary spoke first, his voice measured and formal. He explained that earlier that morning, during a routine inspection of the Queen's jewelry collection, several pieces had been discovered missing. These were not ordinary pieces, but items of significant historical and monetary value. Among the missing items was a diamond brooch that had belonged to Queen Victoria, a sapphire necklace worn by the Queen Mother at her coronation, and a pair of emerald earrings that were part of the Crown's official collection. Camilla felt her stomach drop. She had been one of the few staff members with access to the secure vault where the jewelry was stored. Her duties occasionally required her to retrieve specific pieces for the Queen to wear at official functions, or to arrange for their transport to exhibitions. She had the codes, the keys, and the clearance that very few others possessed. The secretary continued, explaining that an investigation had been launched immediately. All staff members with access to the vault were being questioned, and security footage was being reviewed. Camilla tried to maintain her composure, assuring them that she had not taken anything and had last accessed the vault 3 days prior to retrieve a tiara for a photo shoot with the official royal photographer. The questioning lasted nearly 2 hours. They asked about her movements over the past week, who she had spoken with, whether she had noticed anything unusual, and whether she had shared her access codes with anyone. Camilla answered every question truthfully, her mind racing as she tried to recall every detail of her recent interactions with the vault and its contents. After the initial questioning, Camilla was allowed to return to her office, but she could feel the weight of suspicion hanging over her. Word had spread quickly through the palace staff about the missing jewelry, and she noticed the sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. Her colleagues, people she had worked alongside for years, now regarded her with uncertainty and distrust. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated. The palace security chief, a stern man named Colonel Ashworth, arrived at her office with 2 royal guards. He informed her that she was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Furthermore, her access credentials were being revoked immediately, and she was required to surrender her keys and security badge. Camilla protested, explaining that this was a mistake, that she had dedicated nearly a decade of her life to serving the royal household with integrity and loyalty. Colonel Ashworth remained unmoved, stating that these were standard procedures in cases involving theft of royal property. He added that the matter was being taken extremely seriously at the highest levels, and that Scotland Yard's specialized art and antiques unit had been notified as she packed her personal belongings from her office. Camilla's hands trembled. She thought about her reputation, her career, and the years she had spent building trust within the palace walls. Everything seemed to be crumbling around her. She had always prided herself on her professionalism and discretion, qualities that were essential in her role. Now, those same qualities felt meaningless in the face of such serious accusations. Before leaving the palace that evening, Camilla was escorted to a private room where two detectives from Scotland Yard were waiting. They introduced themselves and explained that they would need to conduct a formal interview. The questions became more pointed and detailed. They asked about her financial situation, whether she had any debts, who her associates were outside of work, and whether she had been approached by anyone interested in purchasing valuable items. Camilla answered each question. Feeling increasingly trapped despite her innocence, she explained that her salary was comfortable, that she had modest savings, and that she lived a quiet life in a small apartment in Chelsea. She had no unusual debts, no gambling habits, no extravagant lifestyle that would suggest she needed money desperately. The detectives then revealed something that made Camilla's blood run cold. Security footage showed that on the night the jewelry was believed to have been taken, someone had entered the vault using her access credentials. The timestamp showed the entry occurring at 11:45 in the evening, long after regular working hours. The figure in the footage wore dark clothing and kept their face turned away from the cameras, making identification impossible. Camilla insisted that she had been at home that night, that she had not been at the palace, and that someone must have stolen or copied her credentials. The detectives listened, but made notes with expressions that suggested skepticism. They asked if she could prove her whereabouts that night, if anyone could confirm she had been at home. Camilla realized with growing horror that she lived alone and had spent that evening reading and watching television by herself. She had no alibi. The interview concluded after 3 hours. Camilla was told not to leave London while the investigation continued. As she finally stepped out into the cool evening air, she felt utterly alone. The palace that had been her second home now loomed behind her like a fortress she could no longer enter. She hailed a taxi and gave her address, her mind spinning with questions about who could have done this and why she was being framed. Over the next few days, Camilla's life became a nightmare. The story leaked to the press, and although her name was not officially released, journalists began gathering outside her apartment building. Someone within the palace had talked, and speculation ran rampant in the tabloids. Headlines screamed about betrayal within the royal household, about a trusted aide who had allegedly stolen priceless treasures from under the Queen's nose. Camilla hired a solicitor, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in criminal defense. Margaret reviewed the evidence and agreed that the case against Camilla was circumstantial but troubling. The use of her credentials was damning, and without a solid alibi or evidence pointing to another suspect, Camilla remained the primary person of interest. Margaret advised Camilla to prepare for the possibility of arrest. She explained that if Scotland Yard concluded there was sufficient evidence, they would likely move forward with formal charges. The theft of crown property was an extremely serious offense, one that carried significant prison time if convicted. Camilla felt her entire world collapsing as she contemplated the possibility of being arrested, tried, and imprisoned for a crime she did not commit. Meanwhile, Margaret began her own investigation. She hired a private investigator to look into other staff members who had access to the vault, to examine their financial records and recent activities. She also requested copies of all security footage from the palace, not just from the vault area, but from entrances and exits throughout the building. If someone had used Camilla's credentials, they must have obtained them somehow, and Margaret was determined to find evidence of that theft. As the investigation dragged on, Camilla's isolation deepened. Friends from the palace stopped returning her calls. Her family, though supportive, struggled to understand the complexity of the situation. Her mother called daily, alternating between reassurance and worry. Her sister suggested she flee the country, an idea that Camilla dismissed immediately as it would only make her look guilty. 10 days after the jewelry was discovered missing, Camilla received a phone call that made her heart stop. It was Margaret, and her voice was urgent. Scotland Yard had made a decision. They were moving forward with an arrest warrant. Margaret told her to come to her office immediately so they could coordinate her surrender to authorities in a controlled manner. This would be better than having officers show up at her home or arrest her in public. Camilla's hands shook as she ended the call. She looked around her small apartment, at the life she had built, at the photographs on her walls showing happier times with colleagues at royal events, and wondered if she would ever get that life back. She changed into conservative clothing, gathered her identification and other documents, and headed to Margaret's office with a sense of dread that seemed to compress her chest with every breath. The arrest happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon at Margaret's law office in central London. Camilla sat in a conference room with her solicitor when two detectives from Scotland Yard arrived, accompanied by a uniformed officer. They were professional, but firm as they read her rights, and formally arrested her on suspicion of theft of Crown property. The words felt surreal, like they were being spoken to someone else entirely. Camilla was handcuffed. Though the detectives allowed her to wear a coat over her wrists to maintain some dignity as they escorted her to an unmarked police vehicle waiting outside, Margaret followed in her own car, promising to meet Camilla at the station and ensure her rights were protected throughout the process. As they drove through London's streets toward the police station, Camilla stared out the window at the ordinary lives unfolding around her. People shopping, walking their dogs, heading to cafes. She wondered if she would ever experience that simple normalcy again at the police station. Camilla was processed through the system like any other suspect. Her fingerprints were taken, photographs were captured from multiple angles, and her personal belongings were cataloged and stored. She was placed in a holding cell to wait for the formal interview. The cell was small and cold, with concrete walls painted a dingy beige and a metal bench that served as the only furniture. Camilla sat down and tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that innocent people were arrested sometimes, that this was just a mistake that would eventually be corrected. The formal interview began 2 hours later. Camilla sat across from two detectives in a small room with recording equipment and cameras mounted in the corners. Margaret sat beside her, ready to intervene if necessary. The detectives laid out their case methodically. They explained that the security footage clearly showed someone entering the vault using Camilla's credentials at the time the jewelry went missing. They noted that she had no verifiable alibi for that evening. They pointed out that she was one of only 6 people in the entire royal household with the level of access required to enter the vault after hours. Then they revealed new information that sent chills down Camilla's spine. Financial investigators had discovered that 3 weeks before the theft, someone had made inquiries about selling rare gemstones through a private dealer in Hatton Garden, London's historic jewelry district. The inquiries had been made from an email address that, while anonymous, had been traced back to an IP address near Camilla's apartment building. Furthermore, deposits totaling £15,000 had appeared in a cryptocurrency account that investigators believed was linked to her. Camilla felt her world tilt. She had never made such inquiries. She knew nothing about cryptocurrency accounts. She had never contacted any dealers in Hatton Garden. She tried to explain this to the detectives, but her protests sounded weak even to her own ears. How could she prove she had not done these things? How could she demonstrate that someone else had created false digital trails leading back to her? Margaret interrupted the interview to request a break so she could confer with her client. In a private room, she explained to Camilla that the situation was more serious than they had initially understood. Someone had clearly gone to great lengths to frame her, creating a comprehensive digital footprint that suggested premeditation and criminal intent. Margaret asked pointed questions about Camilla's computer security, her passwords, who might have had access to her devices or her apartment, and whether she had noticed anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the theft. Camilla thought back carefully. She remembered that her laptop had been acting strangely about a month ago, running slowly and occasionally opening programs on its own. She had assumed it was a virus and had run antivirus software, but perhaps it had been something more sinister. She also recalled that her apartment had been cleaned by a new member of her regular cleaning service around that time, someone she had not met before. At the time, she had not thought much of it. But now every detail seemed potentially significant. The interview resumed, and Margaret began to present their theory that Camilla was being framed. She pointed out that someone with sophisticated knowledge of computer systems could have hacked Camilla's devices to create false trails. She noted that Camilla's access credentials could have been copied or stolen. She argued that the evidence, while circumstantial, did not prove that Camilla herself had committed the theft. only that someone had gone to considerable effort to make it appear that way. The detectives listened, but remained unconvinced. They explained that in cases involving Crown property, they had to follow the evidence where it led, and currently all evidence pointed to Camilla. They informed her that she would be held overnight pending a bail hearing the following morning. Camilla felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break down. That night in the holding cell was the longest of Camilla's life. She could not sleep despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Who was doing this to her? Why had she been targeted? Was it someone from the palace who resented her position or held a grudge? Was it an organized criminal enterprise that had identified her as a convenient scapegoat? The possibilities seemed endless and equally terrifying. The bail hearing took place. The next morning in a magistrate's court, Camilla stood before the judge, her solicitor beside her. As the prosecution outlined the charges and the evidence against her, the prosecutor argued that Camilla represented a flight risk given the severity of the charges and requested that she be remanded in custody until trial. Margaret countered passionately, arguing that Camilla had deep roots in the community, no criminal record, and had cooperated fully with the investigation from the beginning. She presented character references from colleagues and friends who attested to Camilla's integrity and honesty. After considering both arguments, the judge granted bail, but with strict conditions. Camilla was required to surrender her passport immediately. She was prohibited from leaving London without permission from the court. She had to report to a police station twice weekly. And most significantly, she was forbidden from having any contact with current or former royal household employees who might be witnesses in the case. The bail amount was set at £50,000, a sum that would require Camilla to use all her savings and borrow from family members. Over the next week, Camilla worked with Margaret to build a defense. The private investigator Margaret had hired began uncovering interesting information. He discovered that another staff member, a man named Peter Thornton who worked in palace security, had been experiencing serious financial difficulties. Peter had gambling debts totaling over £80,000 and had been receiving threatening calls from loan sharks. More importantly, Peter had the technical knowledge and access necessary to copy security credentials and manipulate security systems. The investigator also found that in the weeks before the theft, Peter had been seen meeting with a man who was later identified as having connections to organized crime groups specializing in art and jewelry theft. Surveillance photographs showed the two men together at a pub in East London, deep in conversation. This information was immediately turned over to Scotland Yard, but the detectives seemed reluctant to shift their focus away from Camilla. Meanwhile, the media attention intensified. Although Camilla's name had not been officially released, investigative journalists had pieced together her identity. Reporters camped outside her apartment building 24 hours a day. Her photograph, taken from social media accounts she had since deleted, appeared in newspapers alongside speculation about her motives. The tabloids painted her as a trusted insider who had betrayed the royal family for financial gain. Some articles suggested she had been living beyond her means. Others implied she had been recruited by international criminal networks. The truth was far more mundane and far more tragic. Camilla was an ordinary woman who had worked hard to build a career she loved, only to have it destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. She had become a prisoner in her own apartment, afraid to go outside and face the cameras and questions. She had her groceries delivered and communicated with the outside world primarily through her solicitor. 3 weeks after her arrest, Margaret received a call from an unexpected source. A woman named Elena Vasquez, who worked as a junior administrator in the palace's housekeeping department, requested a confidential meeting. Elena claimed to have information relevant to the case, but was afraid to go directly to the police. Margaret arranged to meet her at a cafe far from the palace and from Camilla's neighborhood to ensure privacy. Elena's story was explosive. She explained that she had been romantically involved with Peter Thornton several months earlier. The relationship had ended badly when she discovered he had a gambling problem and had stolen money from her purse. In anger and hurt, she had begun to distance herself from him. She had noticed his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and secretive in recent weeks. On the night of the theft, Elena had been working late at the palace, organizing linens for an upcoming event. Around 11:30 in the evening, she had seen Peter moving through the corridors in dark clothing, which struck her as odd because his shift had ended hours earlier. He had looked startled when he saw her and had made a weak excuse about forgetting his phone. Alina had thought little of it at the time. But after hearing about the theft and Camilla's arrest, the pieces had begun to fit together in her mind. Most damning of all, Alina revealed that Peter had approached her 2 days after the theft, offering her £5,000 in cash if she would take a vacation and leave London for a few weeks. He had claimed it was a gift to make up for his past behavior, but the timing and the amount had seemed suspicious. Alina had refused and had been avoiding Peter ever since, but his offer had left her deeply uneasy. Margaret immediately took this information to Scotland Yard, demanding that they investigate Peter Thornton thoroughly. She also filed a motion with the court to have the charges against Camilla dismissed based on this new evidence. The police, perhaps embarrassed by the possibility that they had arrested the wrong person, finally agreed to bring Peter in for questioning. Peter's interrogation revealed cracks in his story almost immediately. When confronted with Elena's testimony and the evidence of his financial problems, he became defensive and evasive. A search of his apartment uncovered documents related to the cryptocurrency account that had been linked to Camilla, along with sophisticated computer equipment capable of hacking into security systems. Most significantly, investigators found a small velvet pouch hidden in his bedroom that contained tools used for bypassing electronic locks. Under pressure and faced with mounting evidence, Peter finally broke down and confessed, though not to the full extent of his crimes. He admitted that he had stolen Camilla's security credentials by copying them while she was distracted during a staff meeting. He had used specialized software to hack into her laptop and create the false digital trail suggesting she had contacted jewelry dealers. He had entered the vault using her stolen credentials, carefully timing his entry to avoid guard patrols, and had taken the jewelry with the intention of selling it through criminal contacts. However, Peter maintained that he had acted alone, a claim that investigators doubted. The sophistication of the operation suggested that he had received help from someone with more experience in high-value theft. Detectives suspected that Peter had been recruited by an organized crime group specifically to infiltrate the palace security system. But proving this connection would require more investigation. Following Peter Thornton's confession, Camilla expected the charges against her to be dropped immediately and her life to return to some semblance of normalcy. Instead, she found herself caught in a bureaucratic nightmare that seemed designed to prolong her suffering. The Crown Prosecution Service moved slowly, requiring additional statements, verification of evidence, and multiple reviews before they would formally withdraw the charges. Meanwhile, Camilla remained under bail conditions, still required to report to the police station twice weekly. Still forbidden from leaving London, Margaret fought aggressively to expedite the process, filing motions and making daily calls to the prosecutor's office. She argued that every day Camilla remained under suspicion caused irreparable harm to her reputation and career. The media, however, was slower still to correct its earlier coverage. While some outlets reported Peter's arrest and confession, the stories were buried on inside pages, lacking the sensational headlines that had accompanied Camilla's arrest. Too much of the public, she remained the trusted royal aide who had betrayed the queen. Regardless of the truth, the toll on Camilla was immense. She had lost nearly 15 pounds from stress and lack of appetite. She suffered from insomnia, lying awake most nights, replaying every moment of the ordeal in her mind. Her savings were depleted from legal fees and living expenses during her forced unemployment. Most painfully, she had lost the career she had worked so hard to build. Even if the charges were dropped, she knew she could never return to her position at the palace. The trust that was essential to her role had been shattered, not by her actions, but by the mere accusation. 6 weeks after Peter's confession, the charges against Camilla were officially withdrawn. The prosecutor released a brief statement acknowledging that Peter Thornton had been charged with the theft of Crown property and that Camilla Parker was no longer considered a suspect. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the damage that had been done. Just a bureaucratic notification that the matter was closed as far as she was concerned. Camilla, stood in Margaret's office as her solicitor read the notification aloud. She had imagined this moment would bring relief, perhaps even joy, but instead she felt numb. Being cleared of charges did not erase what she had endured. It did not restore her reputation or her career. It did not give her back the peaceful nights of sleep she had lost, or repair the relationships with colleagues who had doubted her. Margaret tried to be optimistic, suggesting that they could pursue legal action against the police for wrongful arrest, or sue the newspapers that had defamed her character. Camilla listened, but felt no enthusiasm for prolonging her connection to this nightmare. She wanted to move forward, to somehow rebuild her life. But the path forward seemed impossibly unclear. The royal household sent a formal letter, acknowledging the withdrawal of charges and offering their regrets for the difficult situation. The letter was signed by the Queen's private secretary and was carefully worded to avoid any admission of wrongdoing by the palace. They offered to provide a neutral reference for future employment, but made no mention of reinstatement or compensation. Reading between the lines, Camilla understood that she was being politely but firmly cut loose. Her 8 years of dedicated service had been erased by circumstances beyond her control. Camilla had to face practical realities. Her apartment lease was ending, and with her savings depleted, she could not afford to renew it. She began the process of packing her belongings, sorting through the physical remnants of her life in London. Each item carried memories of better times. The designer handbag she had saved for months to buy after receiving a promotion, the framed photograph of her meeting the Queen at a garden party, the collection of event programs from royal functions she had helped coordinate. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life now. Her family urged her to return to her hometown in the north of England, to stay with them while she regrouped and decided on her next steps. Camilla resisted at first, feeling that returning home would be an admission of defeat, a retreat from the life she had built in London. But as her financial situation became more precarious and her isolation more complete, she reluctantly agreed. Before leaving London, Camilla decided to do something she had been avoiding. She reached out to Elena Vasquez, the woman whose testimony had ultimately exposed the truth. They met at a quiet tea shop in a neighborhood far from the palace and from the press. Elena was younger than Camilla had expected, perhaps 25. With kind eyes that reflected genuine concern, Elena apologized repeatedly for not coming forward sooner, explaining that she had been terrified of losing her job or becoming a target herself. She had wrestled with her conscience for weeks before finally contacting Margaret. Camilla assured her that she understood and was grateful that Elena had ultimately found the courage to speak up. They talked for nearly 2 hours about their experiences at the palace, about Peter and his deceptions, and about the strange bond that trauma creates between people. Elena revealed that she too was leaving the palace. The entire scandal had made her uncomfortable, and she felt she could no longer trust the people she worked with. She had accepted a position with a private estate management company and would be starting in a few weeks. As they parted, Elena hugged Camilla tightly and whispered that she hoped Camilla would find peace and happiness again. Camilla thanked her, but could not bring herself to express similar hopes aloud. Uncertain if such things were still possible, the day before Camilla was scheduled to leave London, Margaret called with unexpected news. Peter Thornton's case had taken a dramatic turn. Under intense interrogation and facing decades in prison, Peter had finally agreed to cooperate fully with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He had provided detailed information about the criminal organization that had recruited him and had revealed the location where the stolen jewelry had been hidden. A raid on a storage facility in southeast London had recovered all the missing pieces intact: the diamond brooch, the sapphire necklace, the emerald earrings. All were carefully wrapped and stored in a climate-controlled unit rented under a false name. The discovery was being hailed as a major success for Scotland Yard's art theft unit. Photographs of the recovered jewelry dominated the news cycle. Peter's testimony revealed that he had been approached by members of an Eastern European criminal syndicate that specialized in high-value thefts. They had identified him as vulnerable due to his gambling debts, and had offered to pay off his debts in exchange for his help stealing from the royal collection. They had provided him with the technical equipment to hack Camilla's computer and had coached him on how to frame her convincingly. The plan had been to wait several months for attention to die down before moving the jewelry through black market channels to buyers in Asia. The revelation that Peter had been part of a larger criminal conspiracy cast the entire incident in a different light. News coverage began to shift, portraying Camilla less as a suspect and more as a victim, who had been deliberately targeted and framed by sophisticated criminals. Some newspapers even published follow-up articles examining how the rush to judgment had damaged an innocent woman's life, though these pieces still failed to capture the full extent of the destruction that had been wrought. Margaret saw an opportunity in this new narrative. She contacted several of the newspapers that had most aggressively covered Camilla's arrest and offered them an exclusive interview in which Camilla would tell her side of the story. The interviews would be done on Camilla's terms, with questions submitted in advance and a portion of any payment going to a charity supporting wrongly accused individuals. Margaret argued that this was not just about money, but about reclaiming Camilla's narrative and ensuring that the public record reflected the truth. Camilla was reluctant at first, having no desire to relive the trauma publicly or to subject herself to further scrutiny. But Margaret persuaded her that controlling her story was important, that allowing others to define her experience would leave her forever at their mercy. Finally, Camilla agreed to one major interview with a respected journalist known for thoughtful, in-depth reporting. The interview took place in Margaret's office, a neutral setting that felt safe enough for Camilla to speak openly. The journalist, a woman named Claire Sutton, who had been covering criminal justice issues for 20 years, approached the conversation with sensitivity and intelligence. She asked Camilla about her background, her career at the palace, and then carefully walked through the ordeal she had experienced. Camilla found herself speaking more freely than she had expected, describing the shock of being accused, the loneliness of facing suspicion from people she had considered friends, and the terror of potentially spending years in prison for something she had not done. She talked about the financial devastation, the damage to her reputation, and the profound loss of trust in institutions she had believed would protect the innocent. Claire asked difficult questions about the investigation, about whether Camilla felt the police had acted appropriately, about whether she believed the royal household had supported her adequately. Camilla answered honestly but without bitterness, acknowledging that the police had followed procedures, but suggesting that those procedures needed reform when dealing with circumstantial evidence. She was more critical of the palace, noting that their desire to protect the institution had left individual staff members vulnerable and unsupported. The interview was published on a Sunday and created significant response. Many readers expressed outrage at how Camilla had been treated, and there were renewed calls for police reform and for protections for individuals accused based on circumstantial evidence. Some members of Parliament raised questions about whether the royal household needed better protocols for supporting staff caught up in investigations. The story even prompted the Home Secretary to order a review of procedures used in high-profile cases. For Camilla, the attention was overwhelming, but not unwelcome. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt that people were actually seeing her as a person rather than as a character in a sensational story. Messages of support began arriving through Margaret's office, from strangers who had been moved by her story and from advocacy groups working on justice reform. Several job offers came in as well, though Camilla was not yet emotionally ready to consider employment. The compensation from the interview, while helpful, could not repair all the financial damage she had sustained. Margaret had begun preliminary work on a lawsuit against Scotland Yard for wrongful arrest and against several newspapers for defamation. But such cases could take years to resolve and were far from guaranteed successes. In the meantime, Camilla needed to find a way to support herself and begin rebuilding her life. She delayed her move back north, using some of the interview payment to extend her apartment lease for another month. She needed time to think, to process everything that had happened, and to make decisions about her future when she was not in a state of crisis. For the first time in months, she had the luxury of space to breathe and consider what she actually wanted rather than simply reacting to immediate disasters. 8 months after the ordeal began, Camilla's life had taken on a shape she could never have predicted. The lawsuit Margaret filed against Scotland Yard and the tabloids was progressing through the legal system, though slowly. More importantly, Camilla had found an unexpected and immediate path forward that gave her life new meaning and purpose. She had been contacted by a nonprofit organization called Justice Advocates that worked to support individuals who had been wrongly accused of crimes. The organization's director, a former barrister named Thomas Wright, had read Camilla's interview and been moved by her story. He invited her to speak at one of their support group meetings, thinking that sharing her experience might help others who were navigating similar nightmares. Camilla had been nervous about the speaking engagement, unsure if she had anything valuable to offer people who were still fighting for their freedom or their reputations. But when she stood before a room of 20 people who had all experienced wrongful accusations, she felt an immediate connection. These were people who understood the unique trauma of being presumed guilty, of having their lives dissected by strangers, of losing everything while powerless to defend themselves. She spoke for 30 minutes, telling her story with more honesty and vulnerability than she had managed in the published interview. She talked about the practical challenges like managing finances during forced unemployment and dealing the mental health impact of constant stress. She discussed the emotional difficulty of accepting that some relationships could not be repaired and that some damage could not be undone. But she also talked about finding unexpected sources of strength, about learning to advocate for herself, and about the importance of having good legal representation. The response was overwhelming. Several people approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking her for putting into words what they had been feeling but could not express. Others asked practical questions about how she had managed various aspects of her case. Thomas Wright invited her to return for future meetings, suggesting that she clearly had a gift for connecting with people in crisis. Over the next few months, Camilla became a regular speaker at Justice Advocates events. She also began volunteering with the organization in other capacities, helping to review cases, connecting people with resources, and even assisting with fundraising efforts. The work was unpaid, but deeply fulfilling in ways her palace job had never been. She was making a real difference in people's lives, helping them navigate systems that seemed designed to crush anyone caught in their machinery. Thomas eventually offered her a paid position as the organization's client services coordinator. The salary was modest, far less than she had earned at the palace, but it came with purpose and dignity. Camilla accepted without hesitation. For the first time since her arrest, she felt like she was moving toward something rather than just away from disaster. Her personal life was slowly improving as well. She had reconnected with old friends who had remained supportive throughout her ordeal, and she was gradually learning to trust people again. She began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, and the weekly sessions helped her process the complex emotions that still surfaced unpredictably. She started exercising regularly, finding that physical activity helped quiet the anxious thoughts that had plagued her. For months, the legal proceedings finally came to a resolution almost a year after Peter Thornton's confession. Peter was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the theft of Crown property, with additional charges related to his involvement with the criminal organization that had recruited him. Several members of that organization were also arrested and prosecuted, dismantling a network that had been responsible for numerous high-value thefts across Europe. Camilla's lawsuit against Scotland Yard was settled out of court. The Metropolitan Police agreed to pay her £60,000 in compensation and issued a formal apology acknowledging that their investigation had been flawed and had caused her significant harm. They also committed to implementing new training protocols for officers handling cases based on circumstantial evidence. It was not everything Camilla had hoped for, but it was a meaningful acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The cases against the newspapers were more complicated. Several publications offered modest settlements and printed small corrections, but the legal battles dragged on with others. Margaret advised Camilla that she could continue fighting for larger payouts, but the emotional cost would be significant. After much consideration, Camilla decided to accept the settlements that had been offered and drop the remaining cases. She needed to close this chapter of her life, and pursuing years of litigation would keep her tethered to the past. With the settlement money from the police and the newspaper payouts, Camilla found herself in a better financial position than she had been in months. She paid off the debts she had accumulated during her unemployment, reimbursed her family members who had helped with bail, and put money aside for savings. She even allowed herself a small luxury, a week-long vacation to Scotland, where she hiked through the Highlands and felt, for the first time in over a year, something approaching peace. The royal household never formally reached out beyond their initial neutral letter. Camilla had not expected them to, understanding that institutions protect themselves above all else. She had made her peace with the fact that her 8 years of service had been effectively erased. Sometimes she felt angry about this, but mostly she felt a strange sort of gratitude for being forced out of a world that now seemed shallow and self-serving compared to the work she was doing. One unexpected development came from Elena Vasquez, who had maintained contact with Camilla throughout the aftermath. Elena had thrived in her new position with the estate management company and had been promoted to a senior role. She called Camilla one afternoon with an idea. Her company was looking for someone to develop and lead a new employee welfare program, ensuring that staff working in high-pressure environments had proper support and advocacy. She thought Camilla would be perfect for the position. Camilla was tempted by the offer, which came with a generous salary and the opportunity to create systemic change in how employees were protected and supported. But after careful consideration, she declined. She realized that her passion was for working directly with individuals in crisis, not for building corporate programs. She was exactly where she needed to be at Justice Advocates, and she was not ready to leave. As the second anniversary of her arrest approached, Camilla agreed to do one final interview with Claire Sutton, the journalist who had first told her story. This time, the focus was not on the ordeal itself, but on recovery and rebuilding. Camilla talked about the work she was doing, about finding meaning in trauma, about the importance of systemic reform to prevent others from experiencing what she had endured. Claire asked if Camilla had forgiven the people who had wronged her. It was a question Camilla had asked herself many times. She said that she had forgiven Peter Thornton in a certain sense. Recognizing that he had been desperate and manipulated by more sophisticated criminals, she had not forgiven the police officers who had been so certain of her guilt that they had ignored evidence to the contrary, or the journalists who had prioritized sensational headlines over truth. But she had learned to let go of the corrosive anger that had consumed her in the early months, understanding that carrying that rage would only harm her. The interview concluded with Claire asking about Camilla's hopes for the future. Camilla thought carefully before answering. She said that she hoped to continue her work with Justice Advocates, helping to prevent others from falling through the cracks of a flawed system. She hoped that the reforms the Metropolitan Police had promised would be implemented genuinely and would make a difference. And on a personal level, she hoped to rebuild trust in the world and in people, to find love again, and to create a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do with the second chance she had been given. The article was published on the exact anniversary of her arrest. A deliberate choice by both Camilla and Claire to mark how far she had come. The response was again positive, with many readers expressing admiration for her resilience and her choice to channel her experience into helping others. Several individuals who were facing their own wrongful accusations reached out to Justice Advocates directly, having been inspired by Camilla's story to seek help and support. 3 years after the theft of the Queen's jewelry, Camilla had built a new life that bore almost no resemblance to her old one. She had a small apartment in North London that she had decorated to her own taste, not worrying about maintaining the professional image she had once thought so important. She had a close circle of friends, mostly people she had met through Justice Advocates or her therapy group, who understood trauma and recovery in ways her palace colleagues never could have. She was dating again, though, cautiously. She had met someone named David at a fundraising event for Justice Advocates. He was a social worker who specialized in helping young people in the foster care system, and he had his own history of overcoming adversity. Their relationship was still new and uncertain, but Camilla appreciated his patience with her lingering trust issues and his understanding when she needed space. Thomas Wright had recently announced his retirement from Justice Advocates, and the board had approached Camilla about succeeding him as director. She was honored and terrified in equal measure. Leading the organization would be a huge responsibility, but it would also give her the opportunity to shape how support was provided to wrongly accused individuals across the country. She had asked for time to consider the offer, wanting to be certain she was emotionally and professionally ready for the challenge. On a sunny Saturday afternoon in late spring, Camilla attended a garden party hosted by justice advocates for their volunteers and clients. Standing in a beautiful garden, surrounded by people whose lives had been shattered and who were working to piece them back together, Camilla felt an unexpected surge of contentment. This was not the life she had planned or imagined for herself. It had been born from trauma and injustice and pain. But it was authentic in a way her previous life had never been. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years earlier, so focused on her career and her proximity to power, so certain of her path. That woman had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. But from her ashes had emerged someone stronger, more compassionate, and more purposeful. Camilla would never be grateful for what had happened to her, would never say that everything happened for a reason, or that the trauma had been worthwhile. But she could acknowledge that she had survived something terrible and had chosen to transform that survival into meaning. As the party continued around her, Camilla received a text message from Margaret. The final newspaper settlement had been completed, and the last legal matters from her case were now officially closed. It was the conclusion she had been waiting for, the final punctuation mark on that chapter of her life. She texted back a simple thank you, then put her phone away and returned her attention to the present moment. David approached with 2 glasses of wine and a smile that made Camilla's heart lift. They clinked glasses, and she allowed herself to imagine a future filled, not with plans. Derailed by disaster, but with possibilities built on hard-won wisdom, the road ahead was uncertain, as all roads were. But for the first time in years, Camilla felt ready to walk it without looking back over her shoulder at what had been lost. The title that newspapers had once given her, the royal aide who betrayed the queen, been replaced in subsequent coverage with wrongly accused woman rebuilds life helping others. But Camilla had learned that she did not need others to define her. She was neither a villain nor a victim, neither a palace insider nor an outcast. She was simply a woman who had endured injustice and emerged determined to ensure that others would not have to face such ordeals alone. As the sun began to set over the garden and the party wound down, Camilla helped fold chairs and clean up, chatting easily with volunteers and clients. Tomorrow she would make her decision about the director position. Tomorrow she would continue the slow work of building a life that felt whole. But today, this moment, was enough. She had survived. She had rebuilt, and she had found a purpose that gave her days meaning. The story of Camilla Parker, once destined for royal footnotes, had become instead a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption not through returning to what was lost, but through creating something entirely new. It was not the ending she would have chosen, but it was an ending she could embrace. And more importantly, it was a beginning filled with hope that she had earned through the hardest possible journey.